In the summer of 2024, I travelled to Ladakh with my wife Helene. We had first visited in 2002, and later in 2012 I went again and produced my first film, A Bird Tour of Ladakh. This was my third visit, and as I had documented nearly all the important birds in my first film, this time I wanted mainly to visit Hanle, which was closed to visitors previously and only opened a few years ago. We flew from our home in Goa via Delhi to Leh, the capital and the main city of the region, where we met Blaise Humbert. Like myself, Blaise is an expat who lives in Goa. He's an ornithologist, expert on geese, and since 1996, he has come every year to Ladakh and counted the waterbirds on the main lakes of Chang province. It is very important for people who travel to Ladakh by air to allow for a few days of complete rest in Leh, which is at an altitude of 3,600 meters, before ascending to higher altitudes. We needed 3 full days before our bodies adjusted to the thin air. Leh is a wonderful city with bazaars, shops, restaurants and plenty of tourist attractions. The main site is the Royal Pallas, an impressive building that one can see from nearly anywhere in the city. It is also the place to get organised and obtain permits before going out to explore the rest of the region. On the 5th day, we left Leh and drove towards Hanle. We passed by the famous monasteries in Sheh and Tikse, and in Upshi we left the main highway to Manali and followed the road along the Indus River. This 3,120-kilometre river is the longest in the Indian subcontinent. It rises in mountain springs northeast of Mount Kailash in western Tibet, flows northwest into Ladakh, where it creates a huge open valley, before it enters Pakistan, where it empties into the Arabian Sea near Karachi. Most of the towns and villages of eastern Ladakh, including Leh, are situated in the Indus River Valley or in side valleys adjacent to it. While driving, I spotted a herd of blue sheep, the commonest of the wild sheep species occurring in Ladakh. We stopped to watch a herd of females and young, accompanied by one young male, coming down from the mountain to drink and graze near the river. While watching them, we saw a few of the local birds. There are very few species of bird along this part of the Indus River. Citrine wagtail is one of them, and I managed to get good shots of a female and a male in breeding plumage. Later, we reached Chumatang, a small village that has hot springs and a few guest houses. Chumatang, at 4,000 meters, is about halfway between Leh and Hanle, and it is where we stopped for the night. Next morning, we continued to drive along the Indus Valley towards Hanle. The more we advanced into Chang province, the wider the valley became. Very soon we started to see small herds of Tibetan wild ass, or Chang, as they are known locally. Resembling an African zebra without stripes, this is the largest member of the Asinus subgenus. This graceful, large animal is the most common mammal one can hope to see in eastern Ladakh. They can be found nearly in any large open valley or plateau where they have grass to graze. We were getting closer to the Chinese border, and we saw more and more army camps. The sensitivity of the Indo-Chinese border forces the Indian government to invest heavily in defence. As a result, we now have very good new roads in this remote part of the country. We reached Neoma, the district headquarters. A new phenomenon that has changed the whole strategy regarding travelling in Eastern Ladakh is the new petrol pump that was opened only a few months earlier. Previously, people needed to carry their own fuel, which in our case would have meant about 80 litres of diesel.
Come out! Bikers. Bikers on the roof of the world. Woo!
Turns also, turns.
Yes,
We continued driving, and shortly beyond Nyoma, we stopped to watch some waterfowl we spotted in the river. We saw a family of bar-headed geese swimming in the river, and our first black-necked cranes. 5 of these birds were grazing on the far side of the river. The biggest threat to wildlife in Ladakh comes from stray dogs, which is directly connected to growth in human population and army expansion. We saw stray dogs everywhere, and they were the most common animal we encountered. These stray dogs are responsible for half of black-necked crane chick mortality in Ladakh. They also attack young Chang and the nests of ground birds. At Loma Bridge, we left the Indus Valley and entered the Hanle Valley. There are a few military camps between the bridge and Rogo village at the start of the valley, but further on, it is another 40 kilometers drive through open spaces with no modern civilization to be seen. The new road in this vast open area, with hardly any human intervention, is the best part of the journey to Hanle. It's the most favourite destination for bikers, who usually don't stay for more than one night and then ride back. Here we encountered a few nomad camps with their herds of pashmina goats and yaks. There has been a shift in recent years of nomadic people into permanent settlements, and fewer of them prefer the nomadic life anymore. The reasons are not economic. Herding yak and pashmina goats is still profitable, but lack of education possibilities for their children is one of the reasons for the shift in lifestyle. They certainly prefer to buy tents than to stitch them themselves, as they did in olden times.
Patent, no?
Probably.
Blaise says that most of the nomads we saw were Champa people, but some were from Tibet.
I was saying that Champa are not poor. 10 years back they had the old military gypsy. Now they have Scorpio.
Hanle is a vast valley of about 100 square kilometres. At its centre, there is a hill which is not connected to any ridge and is surrounded on all sides by wetlands and grasslands. Blaise, who visited Hanle first in 1999, told us that previously there were many more extensive wetlands. Now there is more dry grassland and very little suitable area for black-necked cranes. On the top of the hill, there is an astronomical observatory, which is operated from Bangalore. There's a nunnery on the side of this hill, and a monastery on a hill at the entrance of the valley. The main village of Hanle is built at the foot of the hill, but there are many more settlements all around, including those of Tibetan refugees and nomads. The fine new tarmac road ends just at the entrance to Hanle Valley. Work is in progress, and probably all the roads around here will be tarred soon. However, driving on unpaved roads created a lot of dust and cost us dearly the next day. One of our tyres blew out while we were driving back to our homestay for the night. We crossed the bridge and drove into Hanle Valley. We passed by Hanle village, where most of the homestays and guest houses are. We continued along the astronomical observatory hill for a few kilometres towards the far end of the valley, until we reached our pre-booked homestay in Punguk. After a long siesta, and after nearly a week in Ladakh, we finally went birdwatching. We drove until we found a suitable grassland at the foot of the Astronomical Observatory hill. We soon saw our first upland buzzard of the trip, first in the grass and then on rocks. We saw 4 upland buzzards in Hanle, and this was the only large raptor species we saw on the trip. We soon started to see many birds, especially young and parents feeding them. There are not many species of birds in Ladakh, but the beauty is that the species that are here are very tame, and it is possible to get very close to birds like nowhere else in India. We soon located one of our main target species, the Tibetan lark. Resembling bimaculated and calandra larks, it is found on high plateau, where it prefers rather wet areas, often on margins of marshes and flooded pastures. It's common and found everywhere on the grassland. Hanle is the most western part of the range of distribution of this bird. Anywhere west of Hanle, it is a vagrant. We followed the road to the west side of the hill, past a gompa and a nunnery, where we met a local bird guide observing a rocky hill. He told us that this was the site for an eagle owl, but the bird had not been seen in the last 4 days because of loud activity in the nunnery. He later showed us the site for Pallas's cat, which was on the same hill but closer to Hanle village. It looked as if a family of Pallas's cats was waiting for us when we arrived at the site a little after first light the next morning. 3 Pallas's cats, a mother and 2 young, were playing together on a rock above their den, and later they went for a walk up and down the hill, clearly not impressed by the presence of people. A guide that later came with his client told us that there had been 3 kittens, but one had been killed by a dog.
So they said that one of the kittens was killed.
Also known as Manul, this is a small wild cat which looks very much like a mini snow leopard. It has long, light grey fur and a long, bushy tail. It's well camouflaged and adapted to the cold continental climate in its native range. Later, we drove to the nunnery a few kilometres further west and were delighted to see a group of photographers pointing their cameras at the rocks above. I was very happy that the owl had been found after it had been missing for 4 days. Indian eagle owl, Bubo bengalensis, was split from Eurasian eagle owl, Bubo bubo, a few years ago. Ladakh is the only part of India where Eurasian eagle owls are found, and as a result, many birders like myself come specially to Hanle, and they create a boom in bird tourism to Ladakh. It was still early morning, and we had seen all our targets in Hanle. Now we could go birdwatching on our own terms. We decided to explore the Hanle Valley. We drove right round the Astronomical Observatory hill, checking all kinds of possible sites. Later, after breakfast, we drove all round the Hanle Valley and into the desert. At one point, the bonnet of the car broke off, and we were lucky to spot it and find it later. We found only 1 pair of black-necked cranes, but no sign of young. Hanle used to be the most important breeding place for this crane in India. Blaise said that on his previous visit to Hanle 25 years earlier, there were very few settlements, except the main village. There were no fences and no agriculture, and much more of the valley was underwater. The condition now does not leave much space for these birds to breed successfully. Other than the cranes, wildlife was thriving. We saw plenty of Chang, Himalayan marmots, red fox, and a group of 8 Tibetan wolves, which seemed to be completely adapted to life near civilization. In the afternoon, we decided to visit the monastery, which sits on a hill in the entrance to Hanle Valley and has stunning views over the valley on the west side and over the Hanle River that flows towards the Indus on the other. Like other monasteries in the region, it was built in the 16th century, but now, although it has undergone some renovations, it is not in use by monks. Next morning, we started driving towards our next destination, Upper Sumdho, where on my last visit in 2012, on a short break on the way to Tso Moriri Lake, we had seen many terrestrial birds, such as Tibetan partridge and Chinese rubythroat. We retraced our route. Near the Indus River, we stopped to watch 3 black-necked cranes drinking in the river. Again, no sign of young. In Mahe, we stopped for lunch in a local restaurant. Later we drove on a little further to Mahe Bridge, where we turned left, crossed the bridge, and left the Indus Valley. We then followed the Sumdho River, a small tributary of the Indus, with a very different landscape and vegetation. We drove past Sumdho Junction towards Tso Moriri until we reached the small village of Upper Sumdho. There is a new guest house on the main road, which caters mainly as a lunch place for travellers on their way to Tso Moriri, where we stayed the night. We realised that the Karagana forest that previously covered the valley had shrunk, and that there are fewer birds than before. After a siesta and a coffee, we drove up to Namshang La, the pass that leads to Tso Moriri Lake, and traced our way back, checking any possible location for Tibetan partridge. The flow of water in the river was very high and covered a footbridge that crossed the stream. The glacier that feeds this stream is melting now much faster than when the bridge had been constructed. It's probably the river that washed away the Karagana plants, which are the habitat for birds in this valley. Next morning, we birded the area from the guest house down to Sumdho Junction. The Karagana bushes that had been thriving and covered with birds 12 years ago were now nearly gone, and we only found common species. We were lucky, however, to see these marmots fighting. Later we drove back to the junction and turned left towards our next destination. Shortly after the junction, we reached the Pugga wetlands, where we saw the first family of black-necked cranes. A pair with 2 large young were foraging in the grass on the south side of the wetlands. South of the grassland, there are some large ponds, where we saw ruddy shelducks standing in the sun and a female in a pond guarding her 10 chicks. The wetlands stretch for about 2 kilometres next to the road and cover the valley. On their south side, there are some large ponds. In the upper part of the valley, there are sulphur hot springs and the ground around is white. We drove further until less than a kilometre away from where the cranes were, on the north part of the wetlands, near pools of hot water from the springs. We saw many vehicles, tents and campers. It was weekend and many people from Leh came to enjoy the nature with loud party music in a wetland which hosts one of the only successfully breeding pairs of black-necked cranes in India.
I tell a nigga go big ride, go blick ride, leave it to the double thick guys, put six guys, drop a day, whoa.
A little beyond Puga, we stopped to search again for Tibetan partridge in a suitable area we had spotted next to the road. We saw many small birds which turned out to be twite. While searching between the karagana plants, my eyes alighted on a large rabbit that froze, thinking I hadn't seen him. Carefully, I pointed the camera, and finally, after 14 years of filming wildlife in India, I got a good shot of a real Indian Khargosh. The drive up to Polokongka La, the pass that separates the valleys of Puga and Sumdho, that flows east to the Indus River from the valley of Tso Kar, went smoothly thanks to the new road, which is still under construction. Just before reaching the pass, the tarred road disappeared, but shortly after, to my delight, it appeared again, and we continued our smooth drive to the Tso Kar Valley with its large saline lake that started to show in the distance.
There's some down there.
We drove down to the lake and along the green marshes between the road and the lake, which are a huge contrast to the harsh sandy desert which is all around. We drove as far as Tukjit, the only permanent settlement around and the only place to get food and accommodation. We checked into one of the few guest houses. We picked up a room with a nice view over the wetlands. Generally, in Chantang province, the accommodation is in new rooms, which are basic but comfortable with an attached bathroom. They usually provide a basic dinner and breakfast and charge between 1,500 and 2,000 rupees per person. Most travellers arrive in the afternoon and leave in the morning. We were planning to count all the waterfowl on the 2 lakes that form Tso Kar Valley, and we stayed for 4 nights. The water tanks are good places to watch local birds drinking. Tso Kar is a vast valley of over 200 square kilometres at an altitude of 4,600 metres. It contains 2 lakes. Startsapuk, a freshwater lake in the south side of the valley that feeds via a small stream, a big lake, Tso Kar, which is very saline and very shallow, in fact almost dry. The name Tso Kar refers to the white salt efflorescence on the margins of the lake caused by the evaporation of the saline water. Both lakes are surrounded by a green belt which is fed by local springs and creates a small wetland. Behind the wetlands there is a vast, flat, sandy desert area with little vegetation. This area is favoured by Chang. The sandy part in the north is the best place to look for Tibetan sand grouse.
$307 bar-headed geese, all adults.
For 3 days, we were mainly engaged in counting birds. We started in Startsapuk, the Sweetwater Lake. To reach this lake involved a lot of off-road driving, partly in areas where there were no tracks at all. It is important to take care and make sure where you drive is safe. On my first visit in 2002, my car sank in the sand and I had to walk all the way to Tukje, about 10 kilometers away, for help. We parked at a safe distance and walked towards the lake shore, not too close so as not to scare the birds. We used binoculars and telescopes to identify and count. Blaise keeps separate lists for nesting birds and for young.
Okay, I see one family of bar-headed geese, 2 adults and 6 babies.
It is not possible to cover all the lake from one side, and we needed to walk and drive to 3 different locations. The last one was on the southern side near a deserted nomad village. We counted 343 bar-headed geese, 320 ruddy shelducks, 1 Eurasian widgeon, 4 red-crested pochards, 2 ferruginous ducks, 2 Eurasian coots, 5 black-necked grebes, 55 great-crested grebes, and 315 brown-headed gulls. We also saw some waders, but in lower numbers than in the Tso Kar, which took 2 days to cover. We saw a few nests of great-crested grebe, but very few nests of other birds. We observed 7 black-necked cranes, the most important breeding bird in Ladakh, but no evidence of young. Later, we drove back to our guest house in Tukje from the other side of the valley, the west side.
Which way do we go? Across this bridge? Of course.
It started raining and visibility became difficult. We drove through a very large area of grass. We drove over a small bridge and followed the way until a watchtower, where we saw this upland buzzard trying to find cover from the rain. We drove on, and near the nomadic settlement of Riul, we saw this very large herd of yak walking down the valley to graze in the grassland. Next morning, before breakfast, I went to Tukje village, which was about a kilometre away from our guest house, to look for little owl. Previously, Tukje was a nomad's camp that was occupied in winter, but now, as tourism grows, some people live there all year round. I was surprised to see this Hume's groundpecker in the village. Previously, I had seen them only to the south of Startsupuk. I heard a little owl calling from the area of the monastery, which is up the hill, so I drove there and searched. I located one bird sitting on a rock. Later, I saw another one down in the village. The monastery was recently renovated, and there is a stunning view from there over all the valley. After breakfast, we went to count birds on Tso Kar, which is a much bigger lake than Startsupuk and required a different strategy. We drove to the place where a small river that comes from Startsupuk empties its water into Tso Kar. Blaise crossed the stream and went on the south side, and Helene and myself were counting on the east side as far as Tukje. The car stayed with us. We had to drive to suitable locations and then walk in the wetlands and try to get close to the lake so we could see the birds. At the end of the day, we drove to the other side of the lake, the west side, and picked up Blaise from Riul, a campsite on the lake shore that has springs with fresh drinking water, where we had arranged to meet. In the afternoon, a storm developed on the south side of the valley, and we were very worried about Blaise. We were very happy to see him in the distance, walking towards the campsite in Riul, where later he was able to have tea with local people he knew from before. The next day, we again split into 2 teams and counted the birds on the east and north sides near Riul campsite. Waders were much more common in Tso Kar, and there numbers will increase when migration season will peak from August to October. We counted 188 Tibetan sand plovers, 114 common redshank, of which we also saw some birds sitting on nests, 1 Terek sandpiper, 8 common sandpiper, 6 common greenshank, 4 dunlin, 86 Temminck's stint, 14 pied avocet, 191 unidentified calidris species, and 980 other shorebirds. The only ducks we saw were 243 ruddy-shell duck. We saw 9 adult black-necked cranes. 1 pair had 1 small chick, and another pair had 2. Numbers of black-necked cranes have increased in Ladakh in recent years, but numbers of successful nests have decreased. Blaise, who has been counting these birds now for 28 years, says that there is a steady decrease in all breeding waterbirds in Ladakh. Ponga Nagu is the name of a place on the north side of the Tso Kar Valley, not far from the Leh to Manali road. There is a stupa and a few buildings, and previously there was a spring of fresh water, and it was a favourite stop for campers. The spring has dried out and the campers are gone. What is left of the spring is enough water for birds and animals to drink, and now, without people around, they are thriving. All day birds came to drink, to wash, and since they do not fear people, they let me take these great shots just before we ended our tour and drove back to Leh.